she or they. My panelists will introduce themselves.
My name is Nikhil. My preferred pronoun is he or they.
Okay, my name is Emily. Pronounce is she.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch
I'm Irene, she.
that. Yes.
Victor Pulla, preferred pronoun he.
And Rebuttal.
Carlo go in first.
No preference.
George go in second. First, not the second.
Hi everyone. Edwin speaking first. I prefer he.
Evan speaking second. I prefer she.
Joe first, he. You second, he.
Maybe first, you or they.
And Martin, he was.
And once we hit the ballot, we'll get going. Thanks. Okay. I would like to invite the Prime Minister to begin this debate.
Sorry, let me just grab my stopwatch.
Yeah, all good.
This debate is about what's best for East Asian peace and U.S. strategic interests. Madam Speaker, what China's been doing in the very recent times is that they've been trying to shore up, they've been trying to reassert their hegemony over the East Asian region. They've been doing that by, building artificial islands in the South China Sea. They've been doing that by, engaging in territorial disputes with their neighbors. We think all of these things are harmful, and we think what the U.S. can do is try to mitigate mitigate these difficulties and mitigate the chance of conflict by actually ceding regional hegemony to China. Right? I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. I'm going to talk about, firstly, desert. I'm going to talk about, secondly, international cooperation, and finally, the risk of escalation, why we need to take that seriously. Right? So firstly, let's talk about desert. Right? So we think by dint of its economic superiority, the U.S. established its position as the global superpower around the mid-1900s towards, well after that. Right? So we think the world let them have their chance, and we think that in the same way, the U.S. has a responsibility and a moral duty to allow, let China have its chance too. But you say, secondly, by dint of the historical humiliation and atrocities committed against them by China and Russia, see, for example, the rape of Nanking, we think that China does deserve some regional hegemony in this region, Madam Speaker. Right? But let's talk more interesting about the practical impacts of this policy, given that we've talked about the moral considerations of this debate aside. Let's talk about international cooperation. We think that what's important to give to China, is that a clarification or is it a okay? So what's important to give to China is a concession on what it views as important, right? And it is essentially what it views as important, given by its actions and given by, what their common beliefs about what China wants, right? China wants to establish itself as a global superpower, and part of establishing itself as a global superpower is by establishing itself as a regional superpower in a moment, right? And establishing itself as a regional superpower means that it has to have hegemony over East Asia. We think that when you give them this concession, they become more cooperative in a range of issues that are particularly useful when it comes to achieving the goals that we want in this debate. Fine.
Yeah, so what do you mean by withdrawing from Southeast Asia? Do you mean that you're going to remove exclusively only military capabilities, or are you also going to withdraw from, the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Look, firstly, obviously, the former of that is clearly part of ceding regional hegemony to China. The latter of that is, more economic integration with the rest of Southeast Asia or the rest of the Pacific isn't necessarily part of hegemony, maybe including China and trying to include China in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and giving it a greater say in what goes on there is part of ceding it, right? Let's interpret this debate reasonably. We think the point is, So let's talk about...
On
a big part of the recalcitrance and belligerence of China is the feeling of encroachment and humiliation by continued U.S. presence in the South Pacific, right? In the Pacific, in East Asia, right? The reason like the fact that the U.S. continues to have a naval presence there means that the China feels its security is at threat, right? The China feels like its strategic interests are at risk. What this means is that when you see these things to China, we think that obviously it's going to feel less threatened in this way and going to become more cooperative about a range of international issues, right? What are these range of international issues? Firstly, when it comes to securing the Malacca Straits from piracy, or piracy in East Asia generally, all of this piracy is incredibly harmful to East Asian economic growth and development. We think that in that way it's useful to promote that in this debate. But we say secondly, we think that China will no longer feel the need to prop up North Korea, right? The reason why China currently props up North Korea is they're trying to use North Korea as a bargaining chip because China is the only one who can keep North Korea in line. And keeping North Korea in line is useful because they possess nuclear capability. They possess long-range ballistic missiles, right? So it's incredibly dangerous for the region, right? And it means that when North Korea stops being propped up, they're less able to do these things and pose a threat to the region, but they're no longer able to make life difficult and miserable for North Koreans, i.e. keeping their population malnourished or keeping their population in internment camps. All of these things are incredibly harmful. When you say, moreover, we think that the point at which countries in East Asia can no longer rely on the U.S. to back them up, right? They currently they're going to stop trying to rely on the U.S. to back them up in conflicts. They're going to want to settle those conflicts among themselves, right? In East Asia. That's really because through diplomatic means. And that's useful. We've seen that already recently when it comes to the Japanese constitution, reforming the constitution by reinterpreting self-defense as defending allies. They've apologized for and started to pay reputations for the abuse of South Korean comfort women and Chinese comfort women in World War II, right? We've also seen like Taiwan moving closer towards reconciliation with China. All of these things we've seen try to defray conflict in the region, and this is useful because obviously all of these things defray conflict in the region, and we're going to promote this process by actually ceding regional hegemony to China. The last thing I want to talk about is about escalation, right? China is pursuing actions that could escalate into war. Right? This is dangerous when it comes to building islands, pursuing territorial disputes by claiming territory to establish their presence, to shore up their strategic positions, right? And we think that all of these things, no thank you, could lead to conflict with the US, right? Inasmuch as we admit that the probability of conflict with the US, of open war, is unlikely, we think the fact that the consequences of this are incredibly large means that we have to take this seriously, so that even a small probability event that has large outcomes is obviously going to be something that we have to take seriously, and is a harm that we have to weigh considering this debate. We say, secondly, we think the very fact that, when we take a look at the build-up to World War I and World War II, lots of the actions that countries pursued in these different instances, they didn't believe that each of these small actions would build up to war, right? It's easy to underestimate the probability of war because, lots of people aren't going to undertake actions. Lots of countries aren't going to take actions that they know will lead to war, right? So in as much as we think that there are certain actions that aren't going to lead to it, right? It's very easy to underestimate the probability of it because, wars can quite easily break out as a consequence of this, right? So at the end of this debate, right, or at the end of this speech, actually, it's pretty clear, right? So the problem with China is that, or the problem with the U.S. presence in China is the U.S. presence in East Asia is it's incredibly threatening to China. And the problem when you threaten China is to become recalcitrant in a lot of issues. When China becomes less recalcitrant in a lot of these issues, you're much less able to promote peace in the region, you're much less able to promote economic cooperation in the region, and we think all of these things are harmful, we propose.
Okay, I thank the Prime Minister for their speech, and now would like to call upon the first speaker of the opposition.
Thank you, Honorable Panel. Our position on opening opposition today is that when international powers compete to establish spheres of influence in the region, it is these smaller, less powerful countries within that region that benefit. First thing I want to do is clear up a characterization of what exactly the situation is within the region, and then after which I will introduce my argument. So we think that the current US policy of fighting Chinese hegemony in the region is one that has been primarily trade-based, right? At the point where the United States introduces the TPP with labor and environmental conditions specifically designed to exclude China just by virtue of the bar they would have to pass, we think that is the kind of thing that shows that the economic policies on face are ones that are designed to exclude China. And when China has a counteracting trade pact in the region that they're trying to start up, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it is clear that what is happening in the status quo is not just economic partnership for the spirit of cooperation, but designed for exclusivity, as evidenced by very lukewarm comments made by the US administration, even if they're about the possibility of China even joining the TPP, and China focusing on the RCEP over inclusion into the TPP in the first place, right? And to the extent that they're talking about military conflict, it's important to analyze the incentives of the various actors, United States and China, and the extent to which that actions happened up until now in the status quo, right? Which frankly has just been, China's built a few islands, by the way, that applies to Japan also building a few islands, but not directly dealing with the United States. Who was involved in has primarily been limited to a couple military exercises that happen to cross over the border of what China considers its part of the South China Sea, and just sort of a demonstration saying, look, we're towing the line here, but it's not anything, no thank you, that would actually lead to conflict, right? And if you look at the impossibility of sanctioning China based on the fact that China owns billions and billions of dollars of US debt, and with it being one of the major trade partners of the United States, it just seems implausible from a self-interest perspective that either the United States or China would want to engage in military conflict in these particular cases. So with that characterization, I want to do one point about standing rebuttal, after which I'll break it down to economic benefits of this arrangement and then regional political benefits. So on the idea of desert, we think that other countries in the region are significantly worse off and equally, if not more deserving, given historical injustices in those particular cases, right? We don't think it's the case that whenever one regional power is attempting to establish itself, that the previous power has to necessarily step down, right? It would be ridiculous to require a country weaken its own currency intentionally so that another new and up-and-coming economic power might be able to get more sway on the international economic sphere. So now I want to talk about the economic benefits and the regional benefits. So firstly, we think or just analyzing the effects of what the regional trade pacts are, China has its Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The United States has the Transatlantic Partnership, or Trans-Pacific Partnership. What those two ultimately are trying to do is establish their own spheres of influence within the region, right? But the ultimate benefit of having both of these agreements, no thanks, is that the net benefits ultimately go to the region as a whole. In terms of, firstly, labor and environmental regulations that come about as a result of the agreements, which protect the workers in that region and stop things like, for example, Beijing being shut down for an entire day, or other countries potentially being shut down because of pollution and the environmental damage that threatens the entire globe. No thanks. The other effect of this is protectionist policies go away, right? Things like the very well-known spaghetti effect in the particular region, where a particular good is sent through its intermediate forms through a whole bunch of different nations because of very disparate tariff policies, is ultimately a very inefficient system, but the one that results from the lack of a blanket agreement, which is what is created when these powers attempt to establish their regional powers. No thank you. But it also prevents the establishment of industries in these particular cases, right? We think that crucial regional trade between the different areas of the world is what allows these less developed nations within Southeast Asia to develop a market for their goods and therefore be able to get the profits that they need to develop to ultimately send out their goods and create a market with exports, as opposed to the opposite when the lack of these agreements, when they're being shut out not only from the rest of the world but also the rest of Southeast Asia by tariff protectionist policies. We think that's a huge harm. We think that furthermore, yeah, sure, but actually I'll take you now.
Okay, well, seeing as the U.S. and China are each other's biggest trading partners, and biggest trading partners have a historical trend towards eventually entering into free trade agreements with each other, isn't that more likely at the point where you remove militarism and nationalism from the equation?
The problem with this argument is that China right now in the status quo is using its economic, or in the absence of U.S. power, has no incentive to create these trade agreements with the rest of Southeast Asia, right? When it wants to maintain its central hub on the wheel position in Asia as it exists right now in the status quo, that is the reason why it cannot exist the multilateral agreements that they're talking about, because it wants to maintain the central trading partnership with every individual country, right? And it's able to block those trading partnerships as well. because it has very strong economic ties to individual members of ASEAN. Secondly, because individual members of ASEAN have very different perspectives on how valuable trade liberalization is. And the consequence is, because ASEAN's unanimous consent structure, which requires each one of its 10 member states to agree to whatever policy it is, it's very unlikely that the bloc is going to be able to create the kind of trade policies that achieve the benefits that we're advocating for in a situation where the United States pressures China because of its policies of economic containment. But also, generally speaking, it's just better to have two major economic players within the area, right? We think that the one belt, one road policy, all it does is it multiplies risk, right? When China suffers huge stock market shocks because it misrepresented the strength of particular assets, when there's just general slowing growth because of China's transition to a consumer-based market rather than one based on manufacturing, these are things that are felt ripples throughout the region that harm the people when there's structural unemployment that results, and we think that it's better to have two sources of employment and two markets there that happen. But the final thing that happens economically is that aid is ultimately less political and more inclusive because China can't condition their aid based on, for example, hiring Chinese workers or establishing more specific ties with China, right? So it stops another one of the uncompetitive practices which might result, no thanks, from the AIIB or other similar developmental aid policies that China is going to be passing. So with the remaining time, I want to talk about the political effects of this. Firstly, rebutting the points of opening government. They say that they're going to stop propping up North Korea, but we think that the countervailing interest here is to admit otherwise, that up until this point, one of their major allies who they staked a lot of their diplomatic power on in that particular case has been wrong up to that point. We don't think this is likely to change, right? Similarly, when they're talking about fighting piracy, I think Chinese goods or Chinese merchants would have a strong interest in fighting piracy in the first place. But we think that the most important point that happens in this particular case is when they're talking about the reconciliation of South Korea, right? And this applies not just to South Korea, but to relations more generally within the area. When China feels the pressure of the United States possibly pulling away people that they might be economically very closely entwined to or politically very closely entwined to, that is what creates the incentive for reconciliation to happen when they feel that those ties are at stake, right? And so in the case of South Korea, if it looks like the United States is getting too close to South Korea, that's when China extends the olive branch over past historical injustices and actually achieves the kind of changes that opening government is so concerned about. For those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Okay, I would like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his speech and now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Honourable Speaker, for all the reasons Carlo told you, which did not receive a significant enough response, avoiding conflict in the region is the most important thing that can be achieved, sheerly down to the number of lives that are at risk, the amount of trade that could be disrupted, and the huge problems that could come from that. We think that because fundamentally, China and the US and the US's regional allies are not implacable enemies. If the US is able to withdraw, this best prevents conflict and leads to a most peaceful situation in the region. I want to bring you 2 points, mostly one, maybe second if I have time. The main point is why China, US, and other East Asian interests will fundamentally align if the US withdraws from the region, and why this is preferable to the alternative that they have to stand behind on first opposition. Secondly, why this will make China more compliant with cooperating with the US elsewhere in the world outside the region. A few points of rebuttal first. Because while the last speaker was very, very fast, instead of a lot of economics, he sort of prefaced a lot of his ideas on things that are wrong way of understanding the debate. Because firstly what he said is, well, the US combats China with trade in the region. We said this is largely false, owing to the fact that actually the US and China are each other's largest trading partners, and it's difficult to understand how the US is using trade to fight China by trading with China. That is unclear with us. We would note that people who are each other's largest trading partners have a historical trend towards eventually entering into free trade agreements with each other. We saw this with the USA and Mexico over NAFTA. We saw this with the formation of the EU amongst the various European states. No, thank you. More on this later. We think that's false. But in terms of how the US does use military against China in the region, which is something he tried to claim they basically don't, I'm now going to discuss some examples. We would note the USA has signed a treaty with Taiwan that says the USA will go to war with China if China annexes or in any way encroaches upon Taiwan. That is militarism. China sees that as a threat. The fact that the US has troops deployed in South Korea, in Japan, in various islands around Taiwan is something that China sees as threats and as military. The fact that the US engages in aerial flyovers over Chinese waters and what the Chinese see as their islands and sends its navy boats right up next to China's new islands in order to provoke them is military action, no thank you, that the USA engages in. These are all threats that if you remove them, massively remove antagonism from China, even if there are also some trade disputes that exist. So it's still a net win on our side. We say this also, no thank you, removes the need for China to respond by allowing North Korea to provoke South Korea, e.g. by sinking South Korean boats, killing South Korean sailors, all of which has the potential for escalation for conflict between South Korea and North Korea, which then draws in everyone's allies in the status quo. That's how you get your path to escalation. So that's problematic. Secondly, no thank you, we've been told that when you have competition, apparently, between big regional powers, this helps the little powers in the region. We say that's especially ironic to say in a region that includes the Koreas, that includes Vietnam, countries that did not have a good experience the last time two regional powers were competing for influence in the region, because they both militarily backed other sides that went to war with each other. Note, there were lots of disincentives to war back then, but conflict still broke out, no thank you, because they were struggling. Finally, we were told, China can't say it was wrong over North Korea. China doesn't have to say it was wrong over North Korea. It can say that its strategic interests have changed, and it now supports a greater democratization of North Korea. In the same way that after denouncing America as the evil bastion of imperialism for a few decades, Mao turned around and met with Nixon when it was in China's strategic interests. We say it is entirely possible for them to sell it to their population in a changing world. That's why most of what we heard was entirely wrong. Go. Go, you first.
Right,
Open
so
it.
if it's the case that China is unlikely to compete with the US on economic fronts because they're huge trading partners, how does that not undermine your argument about the likelihood of escalation between the two countries if they are still each other's biggest trading partners?
Because firstly, often nationalism can get in the way of you seeing your own economic self-interest if you're angry about something or have historical grievances. B, like I told you with the Koreas, there's the potential for accidental escalation, which isn't intended, but happens when you have the mad dog regime of North Korea there being backed up by China. Both problems to your arguments. So, why China and U.S. East Asian interests fundamentally align if the U.S. withdraws compared to the alternative? We would say that the U.S. presence in the region no longer serves the U.S.'s own interests. It's largely a legacy, no thank you, of the Cold War and of World War II, and it antagonizes China for all the reasons that Carlo told you about, and we talked to you about the history of U.S. imperialism in the region. We say the U.S. withdrawal, however, changes this and reduces China's need for militarism and for nationalism, because it no longer needs to stand up to the encroaching power of America in the same way, because America is not encroaching, and it can refocus upon its own economic best interests, which we say are fundamentally aligned with those of its neighbors. Importantly, no thank you, what they need is stability. What they want is trade and investment in the region and amongst each other. Why? Because both China and most of its neighbors are in fact service or export economies that are fundamentally dependent on trade to survive and to prosper. Note that China is the biggest trading partner, not just of the US, but of every other Asian nation in the region. So of South Korea, of Japan, no thank you, and all the others. What this means is that China is much less likely to resist TTIP at the point where it is no longer resisting out of nationalism and a need to stand up to America, but is rather evaluating the fact that it would be engaging in a trade agreement with the US, which is its biggest trading partner. Note that eventually, when the British stopped believing Germany was trying to conquer Europe, that was when they were willing to enter into the EU in a free trade agreement in Europe, no thank you, which fundamentally opened up the area. We say that the rest of Asia, China has an interest in having access to other Asian markets, to being able to invest there. That's why they have an interest in a regional free trade agreement as opposed to not having them. We think, therefore, less likely to oppose them if the US withdraws. But more importantly, this means that China has less need to stand up to the US by engaging in militarism. I'll take closing now if they want to do something. Go. Oh, no, okay. Well, don't worry. Okay. So they have less need to stand up to the US by engaging in militarism. We say there is less need for China to be expanding its military spending, which it has been massively doing every year for the past couple of decades, right? We say that China needs to cut spending somewhere its economy massively in the next 10 years. It needs to do it somewhere. The reason for this is because China has an impending pensions crisis because it has a rapidly aging population because of the one-child policy. And secondly, the Chinese economic slowdown that began occurring this year meant China has a lot less money to go around. This means China may need to engage in some form of austerity, but if it can cut the military, and as a consequence, if you're engaging in austerity, you need to keep the population on side. How do you do this? By playing up historical grievances, by complaining about the fact that Japan still hasn't compensated China for the Chinese comfort women and for the historical crimes, by doing things that exacerbate conflict in the region. As an alternative, if the US withdraws, China can cut its military spending in the region and assuage its population that way by maintaining its services. Most importantly, removing US unilateral backing from Japan, unconditional backing from Japan and South Korea, makes them more reasonable and more likely to make the genuine concessions that they require to do to China. Our allies aren't necessarily wonderful people, and they have their own things they need to deal with. Also note that it's harder for China to coordinate on things like piracy, at the point where they're saying, well, we have to stand up to the US, because then you can't coordinate naval operations with them that help mitigate the pirates. We are very glad that First Opposition has accepted that China doesn't want to annex the region. We think we've made it very clear, once the US withdraws, why that means everyone's interests align better, and we are very proud to propose.
Okay, I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech, and now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Honorable Panner. Opening government has set up the status quo as falling victim to the harms that are inherent in it because China aspires to be a global superpower, not merely the hegemon within its region. Given that they do not ameliorate any of these links, and in fact inflame them when they have no more reason to cooperate with individual countries within that region as they do in the status quo when they have to compete with the United States, we think on a whole, both within the region and on a world stage, the government world is significantly worse. So what I'm going to do in this speech is bring you two areas of refutation. First, I'm going to talk about the characterization of the economic relationships within the region. Next, I'm going to tell you while China will continue to undertake bad policies such as the upkeep of North Korea because it uses it as a bargaining chip on the international stage, not merely on the regional stage. And then I'm going to give you some more substantive material about why we get more conflict and a worse hegemon on their side of the house. So first on the economic characterization. I think that their characterization was both deeply contradictory and also just didn't get at the meat of what Edwin brought you in his speech. So what matters is not the trade relationship between the United States and China, because we agree they are so integrated and essential for one another's economies that they are going to continue trading. What we told you matters is the incentives that each country has to facilitate a trade bloc in the union and in the region and bilateral agreements which it does not benefit from. So in the status quo, both countries have an incentive to do that because the only way that they curry favor and power with countries in Southeast Asia is by increasing overall economic development. So if parties are excluded from regional trade agreements that the other power they're competing with initiated, they can capture political authority and political capital by expanding their trade relationships and by facilitating overall regional development because it's a containment and counter-containment measure. On their side of the house, when the United States withdraws from this realm of economic competition, there is no incentive on the part of China to actually facilitate cooperation between member states in this region when it doesn't take part in them. So sure, China may have bilateral trade agreements with individual countries within the region, but there's no reason for them to actually incentivize the creation of bilateral agreements that it does not take part in. Because if anything, all this would do is reduce the dependence of other nations on their trade, thereby reducing their own political capital within the region, but also create competitors for dominance within the region. Because recognize that China is not only concerned about the United States, they compete with Japan, which also has significant economic power and political capital within the region. So if anything, they have increased incentive to reduce the competitiveness of other countries. I'll take back half.
Given that China is predominantly an export-based economy, don't you think there are reasons that are beyond just political considerations that would make a trade bloc largely beneficial to them?
No, so I think that is a reason why they would want a bilateral agreement so that they can export their goods to a country. However, if they create bilateral agreements between other countries, if anything, the recipients of their goods can replace them with goods from other countries. So I think an export economy that is a hegemon has particular incentives to exclude exports from their competitors. Like, you are literally making an argument for our side of the house. But finally, I just want to point out that this argument is deeply contradictory from opening half. Like, if it is the case that you are incredibly integrated in terms of trade, that is another reason why the US and China will not go to war in the status quo. They say nationalism somehow takes over, but we think particularly in a one-party system that is able to actually reduce accountability to the population, this just isn't that persuasive, and they've obviously been able to avoid war in the past. So I think we need a little bit more distinction and better nuance nuance here. Moving on to my second area of analysis is sort of just like why you still get bargaining on an international stage. So they themselves set up this debate by telling you that China will not be satisfied by dominating Southeast Asia. They want to be a global superpower, right? So they will not give up sponsoring North Korea because that is a chip that they can use when they bargain in the UN Security Council, when they want increased quota rights in the IMF or within the World Bank. So we don't think it's the case that simply when you give them complete control over one region, these types of issues go away. If anything, they just have a greater ability to enforce their will within one area, right? So you're just increasing their power that they can then leverage in other areas. But finally, Cheryl, I'll take you now.
Can you explain who exactly on the Security Council China is going to use North Korea as a bargaining chip against? Because I'm not aware of any countries that has other military bases in the region or in South Korea besides the US.
Yeah, so the United States and other members of the UN Security Council would like to see a world in which sanctions on North Korea are universal. So obviously they can use this as a quid pro quo or issue linkage so that even if it isn't to attain certain goals specific to North Korea, another resolution that goes through the Security Council is more likely to get passed if China has this like bargaining chip in the future. I think it's pretty simple. So again, no, I'm not taking you again. Why we get more conflict? So we think China has historical conflicts with other nations that make it very unlikely that they're simply going to be able to cooperate perfectly moving forward in the status quo. So we think that the issues that they have with countries such as Japan and other nations aren't going to disappear. Second of all, Edwin explains to you why you get less reconciliation on their side of the house. In the status quo, when the United States has power in the area and has control in political capital, China has an incentive to accept reconciliation with Japan or other nations because it's the only way that they can bring their relationship closer and avoid the complete dominance of the United States. On their side of the house, they have no incentive to do that because they know that they have complete control of the region. So when they talk about nationalism leading to conflict, on their side of the house, the Chinese government has absolutely no incentive to counter nationalistic fervors within their country against the Japanese or any other country that may actually lead to conflict in the future. On our side of the house, because countering those narratives is the only way that they compete with the United States, they actually have an incentive to do so. Second of all, under this argument, we think that other countries in the area become more militaristic on their side of the house when they are not protected by the US security umbrella. So the reason that Japan is able to have a primarily defensive military force and other countries have not militarized to the same extent is because they know there is symbolic protection by the United States, i.e. naval exercises, things of that sort, but more importantly, there is a defensive umbrella. So if China were ever to be truly aggressive, the United States would actually mobilize. Thankfully, for all of the arguments they give you about China wanting to demilitarize, we know this won't lead to conflict in the status quo. On their side of the house, when you have a more polarized region, it certainly will.
Okay, I thank the Deputy Opposition Leader for her speech, and now call upon the first speaker of the closing half, the government member.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. This round so far has suffered from a stark lack of comparison between what happens in the United States' interest if they stay in the South China Sea currently and what happens if they withdraw, and also a stark misunderstanding of global trade incentives and what this motion really requires. Just at a very high level, you do not have to have a naval base or destroyers outside of a country to have a trade agreement with that country. We can test, and it was clear in the model, that this motion does not require the United States to stop trading with countries in Southeast Asia. One of our points of extension, with which I will begin, will explain how you actually increase economic integration if you remove the strategic conflicts between the United States and China. This will be in direct refutation to side first off. Next, we're going to deepen the analysis on conflict escalation and talk about the status quo. So I actually lied to you about my order. First, I'm going to talk to you about the status quo and why it is unsustainable. Side opposition thinks that the United States can maintain its influence in the South China Sea indefinitely moving into the future. This is not true. The United States has lost this war, and Chinese dominance of the area is inevitable for 3 key reasons. Firstly, technological advancements. The Chinese military is advancing at a more rapid rate than the United States. They have invested 8 times more. Their military spending has increased 8 times in the past 20 years, and they are specifically developing capabilities to undermine the United States' military efficacy in the Pacific region. These are things like technological advancements that allow them to block out U.S. satellites and to simply destroying vision of the United States of targets in this region. They are developing their military very strongly and tactically to undermine U.S. capabilities in the region. They will gain military dominance, and this is almost a universal conclusion. Secondly, the political will in the relative countries is so disproportionately in China's favor that any sustained conflict that requires investment or political capital will result in China winning this concern. Look at the issue of South China Sea dominance in China domestically versus the United States. In China, it is at the peak of importance. It goes to the fundamental dignity of the Chinese people. It goes to their relevance in the world as a power. It is powerful rhetoric that politicians use to gain and legitimize themselves in the eyes of the people. In the United States, it is like a 3rd page of the newspaper kind of issue, right? Given that the United States has very little political will for conflicts, even in Syria, right, where there are direct existential threats to American troops and American allies, there is very little political will for extreme invasion into military action in this area, or extreme spending of military spending in this area, right? If you draw this conflict out, ask yourself, which party is more likely to devote all of its resources to gaining this influence? Who is it more important for? Clearly China. Chinese dominance is inevitable. Lastly, strictly proximity, right? It is much more easy for China to deploy all of its military resources and capabilities to something that is directly next door to it. These are things like ships, short-range missile strikes that the United States is not capable to make from its bases in the United States. China just has way more resources in the area, and they are uniquely focused militarily on this conflict. The United States is spread out across the Middle East, across around the world. China's military might is focused precisely on this issue. Chinese superiority is inevitable. So, all of the ops that we get about China, checking China's military influence, are completely ignoring the fact that China will win in the long term. What we are left with is a choice between an America that withdraws now gracefully, with control over its circumstances, and develops economic incentives for these countries to obey it, or potential escalation of conflict. Let's deepen the escalation of conflict analysis that we get out of the side first go. Because they say, escalation of conflict is going to happen, it's a bad thing. And then the response that we get to this is there is no political incentive for these countries to go to war because they are such great trade partners. But the problem is that when you escalate militarization in these areas, you box politicians into strong stances that require immediate responses. So, for example, domestic politicians in China, in response to increasing U.S. navigational exercises in Chinese waters, have said on a very strong line that any further encroachment on Chinese water by U.S. military forces will be responded to forcefully, right? And they have actually followed through on this by sending their own ships close to Alaskan islands in the United States, threatening the sovereignty of the United States. This escalation of conflict will lead inevitably to some sort of flashpoint. While countries don't want to go to war, by putting military assets so close to each other in a domestic rhetoric of power, you get conflicts. Like, look, for example, at Turkey shooting down a Russian plane. These countries are trade partners. They are very well integrated, but when you have military assets and a very strong conflict line, inevitably there will be some sort of conflict. The consequences of that were loss of human life and extreme deterioration of the relationships between the two countries. There are economic sanctions being put in place. Russia is retaliating against Turkey. These are the kinds of consequences that the inevitable escalation will happen. So that's on their side of the house. What about on our side of the house? What do we get? What are the benefits to the United States of withdrawing and developing an economic integration? This is our third point of extension. Firstly, you get better economic integration because China no longer sees the United States as a tactical enemy in the South Pacific. China is less likely to flex its economic muscles to demonstrate its hegemony when you give China a very huge domestic victory, a very huge and clear demonstration that they have power in the area. The United States can then take this goodwill and include China in the Trans-Pacific Partnership or come to some sort of joint agreement. Think that the assertion that the United States has to withdraw all economic influence because China is trying to assert dominance supports our theory here that by conceding military dominance to China, given that they're not going to invade Taiwan, you get better economic cooperation between the nations. I'll take back half.
You tell us that you're going to give China more national pride and that is going to make them more peaceful. Opening government tell us that states tend to be their most conflictive when they're nationalistic. Which is it and why?
Okay, Chinese nationalism is not going away, right? Like, it's not, by keeping United States ships and military and challenging Chinese sovereignty in the area, you're not going to diffuse Chinese nationalism, right? I think giving them an area over which they have meaningful influence is a better way to diffuse that powerful rhetoric. Okay, now I'm going to go into direct refutation to the key point of side first opposition, which is basically that China only engages in bilateral or favorable trade terms with these countries because the United States is there. So our first response is the United States will stay there, right? The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a really big deal for the United States. They engage in it because it gives huge economic benefits. These countries have a huge incentive economically to align themselves with the United States because of their enormous market, because of their very strong economy, and they also have an incentive to align themselves with China for similar reasons. Ask yourself the simple question: in which state of the world is China more likely to collaborate economically with the United States in Southeast Asia? Is it a world in which they are conflicting the United States with escalating military tension and challenges to their sovereignty? Or is it a world in which the United States concedes military sovereignty to China over a very core issue of their dignity and national identity? Ask which of those political and economic climates is more conducive to collaboration. The United States and China enter into multilateral trade agreements because they are beneficial to developing countries. That's why the United States is engaged in these multilateral trade agreements, right? They benefit countries, and the economic outcome that is most likely between allies is collaboration. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Member. I now call upon the Opposition Member to begin the closing half of opposition.
Ready? Panel, there is a problem in this debate when noting one proposition has been able to be clear firstly about what it is they even wanted to do, right? From the start of the debate we think that would have been useful. But secondly, more importantly, they never told us why it is morally okay to leave a conflict that you have already committed to defending one side that otherwise gets no representation and no support whatsoever. The only excuse that they give us from that, specifically from opening government, is non-escalation. What they do, however, is they ignore the reasons and the moral imperatives why the US has got involved in Asia in the first place. What we tell you in closing opposition is that these reasons are not over, but in fact more present than ever, that the de-escalation of conflict that both proposition teams want is only another word for a silent oppression of people that otherwise get no protection whatsoever. I'm incredibly proud to stand in opposition for these things. We're unwilling to sit by while China gets away with the harm to people that oppose it. We say that, sure, there might be a conflict, right? But the only reason that people go to conflict ever is because you value the harm, because you think that the harm in the long term, if you do not have that conflict, is worse than the conflict itself, right? So we say that it's still worth entering that conflict. No, two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to take down prop. I'm going to engage with the negotiations with China, where those are not going to suffer under our side. Secondly, with the closing gov claim that you can't keep that influence, and that you cannot keep the influence in the region anyway. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the actual obligations the US has and the harms that happen under this model. So firstly, in terms of negotiations with China, right, a couple of responses to the proposition claims that negotiations are going to suffer. The first thing is to point out that even during World War II, when you had peak nationalism, the embassies of all the countries involved continue to negotiate, continue to have trade deals, right? The fact that China and the US continue to negotiate in the status quo, continue to be trade partners, continue to cooperate in the UN Security Council, continue to cooperate in terms of the Paris climate talks, for example, suggests that it's unlikely that they're going to move away, right? Secondly, insofar as this might change their calculations, I'm not sure where there is any impact if you're going to continue to engage economically with all the other actors in East Asia anyway, through the TPP. So I'm unsure why this is the thing that makes a final difference. But really importantly, right, what we don't know what closing opposition, what no link has been provided from prop, is why giving something China for free and claiming that is then going to make them change their incentives. That link has not yet been provided. In fact, what they concede is that you are going to contribute to the nationalist sentiment in China. that says, yes, we have accomplished things, and is likely to make the more aggressive, like, proposition themselves have already internally conceded this point. When China has nothing to lose, and you've given them all of the influence they want in that region, they're likely to continue doing exactly what they've done so far, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Finally, once they become a regional hegemon, like as opening said, you cannot stop them at a later point. It is very easy, wasn't your hegemon, to continue increasing indefinitely your political power, your economic power by creating institutions, right? Secondly, in terms of whether we cannot keep the influence, 3 responses to proposition. Firstly, they say that China, it just has so much technology and it's going to continue increasing. Again, in tension with opening government, telling us that China is really doing poorly economically and it's going to continue to do worse. We say that the spending is going to decrease in this section. Secondly, they say that there's more political will in China than in the US. I'm not sure this is true. To whatever extent the US benefits economically from engaging with Japan and South Korea through, for example, really, really cheap technology, there is a political will. Also point out that the US has treaty commitments to these countries to stay there, and that is a good factor you can point out in elections, for instance. Lastly, even if we cannot permanently destroy China as a hegemon, right? It is incredibly valuable even if we only slow it down, right? It is incredibly valuable even if we only get more time for people in the area, for nation states, and for individuals living in the regions within China to build up their own democratic institutions, to build up their own economies through US investment, for instance, to be able to build up their own military. Even that, at the absolute best on the proposition, is still incredibly valuable for us. So, let's talk about the actual obligations of the US, right? We see the US's obligations like the actual treaty to Taiwan that proposition talked to us about, like the duties to Japan after nuking it, like obligations to the Philippines, like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Taiwan that seek support from the US as a result of the South China Sea. We also say that they have moral obligations because these are the countries that risk oppression, countries that, and people that have a right to self-determination and to democracy. That is the most important thing in this debate. That is a fundamental right that everyone should uphold in Western liberal democracies, right? The right to democracy and self-determination. So what I'm going to talk to you about is why Chinese hegemony harms people in Southeast Asia if the US withdraws. Note that even on the comparative, if we cannot prevent it, like more time that countries can like develop to build resilience to this is incredibly important, right? 2 ways in which it's harmed. No. Firstly, before this, let's be very clear about how China acts empirically, right? How it's acted with countries and people in the past. Secondly, I'm going to talk about small regions and then small states. So firstly, how China acts empirically. If you look at how China has acted in Africa, if you look at how China has acted with Nigeria, Sudan, and Myanmar, and Vietnam in particular, they're not like particularly economically beneficial, right? They don't allow money to trickle down. They don't care about economic consequences in the long term, but environmental consequences in the long term. They usually export Chinese workers to these nations so that they benefit more rather than populations in that country. They usually invest predominantly in countries that are facing Western boycotts. That means that systematically undermines democratic sanctions to be able to push for democratic governments and positive political behavior, right? Note also that they're very willing to engage in hugely imbalanced trade agreements as they have with Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam in particular, because when they're the biggest actor in the regions, they're the ones that get to set the terms. And finally, note that they're incredibly willing to move away from previous agreements if it's at their convenience. Note that with Hong Kong, they were originally promised far more rights than they would at the end because it was in China's interest to move away from that, to continue pushing for pro-communist, pro-Chinese regimes in that country. We say no thank you, that China therefore is incredibly self-interest when it deals with smaller actors around it, empirically and principally. What then happens in terms of small regions and in terms of small states? We see that in terms of small regions within China and around it, literally very few rights are actually granted to people right now, right? Both in Tibet as in the Muslim Uyghur region of Xinjiang in China. And if you have no other hegemon in the region, no one trying to contest it, you have no political pressure to change. Opening.
Seeing as first off accepted that China does not desire to annex or invade its neighbors, how exactly does China threaten the sovereignty?
This is literally what I'm telling you right now, Jordan. Secondly, let's talk about small states, right? Firstly, we've conceded populations, that's bad. What happens in terms of states? Firstly, you have really pernicious economic influence, right? When China prevents you from your own policy, from your own economic policies through those, the trade agreements that I told you about, where it has an undue balance of power, it prevents you from developing. It forces you to nationalize your interests so that they can get cheaper products. It exports your Chinese workers to those countries, preventing your own populations from getting benefits that they democratically should have. Secondly, they support pro-communist parties and pro-communist policies, both financially, both through the diplomatic means that it has when it is a hegemon in the region. That is what it implies to be able to militarily or financially take over a country. That means that you fundamentally undermine sovereignty and that you fundamentally undermine any hope for democracy, Madam Speaker. We say that it is really, really harmful when you have external actors that will continue unhinged with no one else supporting small states in Asia to support authoritarian communist regimes. They're also incredibly bad for those nations' economy. We stand for sovereignty. We stand for giving those nations a voice and allowing them literally just the option of moving towards a different regime to self-determination self-determination. Their democracies are fragile because they are new and they need support. We give them that protection.
Okay, I thank the closing member for her speech and now invite the government whip to conclude the government case.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to ask 3 questions at the close of this debate. Will the United States maintaining the status quo change anything? Secondly, the economic impacts of this resolution. And thirdly, the impacts on conflict. Beginning with the first question that is central to this debate, because the front half of this debate took a static view of the current situation in the South China Sea. The opposition pointed to benefits of US involvement that they assumed could continue into the near and medium future. We don't think that those benefits they talk about, even to the extent that they currently exist, are sustainable moving forward for the reasons that Joe talks about. The fact that military spending in China outpaces that of the United States, and the fact that it is specifically focused on that region, that the political incentives of voters are people in China as opposed to voters in the US are very disparate with respect to the South China Sea and the proximity of China. What do we hear in response to this? The closing opposition gives us a number of reasons to believe that America's staying can make a meaningful difference. They first tell us that we are in tension with opening opposition, who say that there is an economic weakness in China, but yet they're spending on their military. Those two things can actually coexist, insofar as countries can spend on their military to the detriment of their economy, which is precisely why the United States will not be able to outpace China in the region, because it is willing to incur economic harms to itself to prevent US dominance. Secondly, they say that, in fact, US voters do care about these things. Politicians can point to treaty commitments and the fact that they get technology from places like Japan. Even to the extent that there might be actual US voters who care a lot about these things, which is a claim I'm immediately skeptical about, we are actually comparing the incentives of those voters to voters in China to whom this is an existential issue and framed as an issue of the self-determination of their country. Computers and Nintendo Game Boys don't compare to those kinds of incentives for Chinese voters. That's why, ultimately, China has a much more strong incentive in this region, and in the short to medium term will come to dominate it anyway. At that point, we're left with a critical question that I'm glad closing opposition raises. They say even if all of that is right, it is worth it to slow China down. And it is through that lens I want to analyze the last 2 questions in this debate. Are the harms we incur economically and through conflict worth the price of slowing down a process that will inevitably happen anyway? Let's talk about economic development. The key link from the opposition bench with respect to the economic impacts of this resolution comes from the opening opposition, and their argument is as follows. China only has an incentive to offer favorable multilateral trade deals because it's trying to curry favor with Southeast Asian nations. That incentive doesn't exist when the United States is out of the picture. 2 responses. Firstly, this is empirically not founded in how trade blocs around the world work. Mercosur exists. NAFTA exists. The United States is part of NAFTA despite not trying to combat any other hegemon in the region. Brazil is a part of Mercosur despite being a hegemonic power within South America. The fact that there's no incentive for hegemons to create trade blocs in the absence of a competing rival power is simply not empirically founded. But secondly, and most crucially, Joe gives you a number of reasons to believe that economic integration and cooperation is likely to increase as a result of this policy. Let's look at the kinds of countries they're talking about. They've said that in response to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China created a separate organization that included a lot of nations, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement. A lot of the countries in those 2 agreements are the same. There is no difference between a lot of countries in the RCEP and the TPP. The reason they're forced to join competing organizations is because this is viewed as a strategic imbalance and a strategic competition between the United States and China. Those countries still have incentives to have large trade blocs that can shut out exports from other regions of the world, but they form split ones because there's a strategic rivalry that stops a large pool forming that gives greater access to markets. That's the economic inefficiency they create on their side of the house that we're able to fix when economic ties are not viewed as symbiotic with political rivalries. That's the big shift we allow on our side of the house. Let's talk about conflict, because I think that's a second vital part of this resolution. What we've told you down the prop bench is that there's a significant risk of conflict escalation in the South China Sea. That's why it's not worth the price to just slow down an inevitable process, as closing opposition talks about. The price of slowing down the process is at any moment you risk it flaring up into something much worse. Opening government talks to you about the fact that sometimes accidents happen and that it is often the case that these conflicts escalate. Joe specifically talks to you about the political incentives at play in these countries. That because of the heated rhetoric in China that occurs when the United States sails ships close to its islands, it is boxed into a position where it's forced to take aggressive action to save face among its voters. And the same is true of like the US president. If China was ever to accidentally fire upon a US warship, a president who failed to take strong measures in response would be incredibly vulnerable to getting voted out of office in a subsequent election. That's why conflict escalation is a massive harm on their side of the House. What do they have against that? Their main claim, given that both sides of the House seem to agree that overt Chinese invasion of countries is not likely, their claim is one of silent oppression. That's the big claim we get. I'll take you now, before I talk about silent oppression.
The argument isn't just that these agreements multilaterally don't happen. It's that when the United States is the other agent that can provide a better deal on more favorable terms, China can't leverage its position as the hub on the wheel in terms of trade, in terms of Southeastern trade, to get more favorable circumstances that exploit other countries.
No, the fact is that China, and actually this is actually quite closely related to the Chinese oppression point, that China is not able to force other countries to accept terms of trade that toss bad things to it. The presence of US warships and US military does nothing to stop soft Chinese oppression. The reason for that is that China knows the United States will never militarily act in response to an unfavorable trade document signed between China and Myanmar. That simply, the status quo does nothing to stop soft oppression, so all those problems are going to happen, no thank you, on their side of the house. Secondly, and very importantly, China has a huge incentive to ensure its relations with ASEAN, broadly speaking, are positive. It is a crucial source of export and trade for it. Its exports and relations there have increased substantially in the last 15 years. And finally, I think this is absolutely critical, when we deal with soft oppression, and we're talking with these kinds of problems, the United States is ultimately in a position where it will remain intertwined with China. And there are all kinds of international constraints on China's actions with respect to oppressive actions in terms of overt aggression. And the United States will continue to have a source of products that the Chinese middle class is very desirable for and be an important source of trading partnerships for China. The question of this debate is, in what world are we most likely to stop overt aggression? And it is when we don't allow conflicts to escalate. Soft oppression will happen on both sides of the House and is happening. Look at all the examples they already provide you on closing opposition. Soft oppression will happen on both sides of the House. The question is, given that it has been largely conceded or not effectively refuted by the opposition, that China will come to dominate this region anyway, the question is, in what circumstances should the United States seek to orchestrate a withdrawal? Should it seek to orchestrate it on its own terms, where it seeks to gain cooperation with China and goodwill with China, and in a situation that minimizes conflict escalation? Or should it seek to drag out and slow down an inevitable process, putting the lives of millions in Southeast Asia at risk in the process? We would say the former is preferable. We beg to propose.
Okay, I thank the government whip and call upon the final speaker of this debate, the opposition whip.
Facts. China has a territorial claim to Taiwan. Fact. China has massive disputes over areas controlled by Japan that they try to claim militarily. Fact. North Korea has a territorial claim to South Korea. These are facts that lie before the House. And all the chat about trade does not change for a moment the fact that there are real people who live in fear, who do not know whether or not their own country and their own government and their military can stand up to pressure from China, whether it's military pressure, whether it's trade pressure, unless they have someone backing them up. Fact. The US has committed to backing and supporting these countries. We have people that rely on that support and that protection in order to be able to live their normal lives. Note, dear panel, that all the teams who have spoken about trade today have not for a moment said why trade is so massively important, why this increase or decrease in trade that will happen to some extent is this vital thing that we should consider in a debate which is about what the US should do that hasn't specified the particular interests. What we have identified, and what is the most crucial thing in this debate, is the fact that we have a definite shift in how people can go about their lives, how they can rely on their governors being able to enact the policies that they vote them to do without external pressure. That is something that the US is safeguarding by ensuring that the pressure placed by the existing Chinese military does not make these small countries crumble. Because of that, nothing of what happened in the government bench stands. Second thing to note, before we look at more clashes, the mechanism that is missing to the entire government bench is why it is the case that we give China something for free from the US. That changed the fact that they would benefit from subduing or isolating Japan, that they would benefit from having a North Korea that might control South Korea as well, but they would benefit from controlling Taiwan. All those benefits that exist in the incentives of China still exist. So maybe we lose the nationalist narrative that pushes them to action. But we also lose the massive cost of provoking the US. We would suggest that probably the cost and harm and the loss of political capital when you engage in military conflict with another superpower is probably a greater disincentive than the additional incentive of additional nationalism. So since we don't have a mechanism for otherwise why the incentives of China will change in respect to those countries that they were military to way prior to US commitments in that area, it's unclear why any of that will change. Having got that out of the way, here's what I want to chat more about. First of all, I'm going to talk about engage with the closing opposition case and closing government case and show precisely why the things they say are not, as they claim, like debate winning or significant. In other words, it's not the case that just because there might be an inevitable win for China in the long term, that is a reason why we shouldn't try to stop in the short term. And also, why the trigger and provocation thing is not something necessary to lead into conflict. They're going to show precisely why these countries need this so much and why that transcends any importance of trade. So let's look at the first thing about the inevitable win. The first thing we get is this claim that they're going to keep spending on the military, they're going to do it all the time, there's an incentive to do that. But they also say that there's a massive political capital and that is will never get exhausted in China. We suggest throughout the bench that it's likely that the increased military spending is a big drain on political capital. At the point when China probably has less money, keeping spending in that area probably reduces political capital. That probably gives legitimacy to a standoff in the US. So even if the US might have less political capital, even if we weigh up the amount of political capital, that doesn't mean that when one area of political capital exhausts, that's the end of how this works. The only thing we need to show is that there's sufficient political capital in the US to want to maintain enough of a deterrent so that eventually China the population in China will resent the fact that massive spending is spent on the military and try and push the government to relinquish these kind of claims and engage in negotiation. That's what we need. But even if that's not the case, no thank you. We think that even if we delay it, because it's not happening right now, because we have this, and we see a slower withdrawal from this area, a more multilateral withdrawal from this area, instead of immediate disappearance that they are showing, that they are defending outside government, we think that even in that case, what we're buying massively important time, which are due to two things that are happening in the status quo. First of all, we allow all the smaller countries to become more financially independent. They might be able to trade with more people, access more markets. They might be able to develop their economies more. They might be able to do all these things that allow them to stand up more from pressure from China when China becomes the global hegemon, if that's what they say. So even in that scenario, we still benefit from that delay. Secondly, we're also seeing a massive tendency of moderation in China over this latest period. We think it's likely that trend might also continue, which means that if they get hegemony later on, they might be more likely to respect democracy, more likely to respect minorities. No, thank you. In terms of the whole logic, triggers will inevitably lead to more conflict and more war. Let's just point out that has been true in some cases. We've also seen cases like, for instance, in Cuba, where there were triggers and provocations and so on. We haven't seen a massive hot war in Cuba. The logical link for why in this case there's a particular trigger point where we're going to be pushed into war just because this level of provocation that's happened for decades has been completely lacking from government. And I'm hoping that opening will provide that for me.
Sir, China's upcoming pensions crisis and its economic slowdown means that it will need to cut spending somewhere and soon. Is it more likely to cut its military spending if it isn't engaged in a regional military rival with the US, or if it is?
I think that if they have incentive to cut down their military spending, given that the US is not an active threat to their sovereignty, but rather the protection of other countries' sovereignty, they're probably able to make that kind of decision. That's not really a debate. Look. What has Olivia brought you to this debate that is massively important? What she says is that there are lots of small states that necessarily need protection. Jordan asked in a point of information, but didn't your opening concede that they weren't going to annex it? Maybe they're not going to annex the entire region. They probably want to annex Taiwan. They probably also want to threaten a lot of countries in this area with their military presence to force government to change their decision-making metric so that it suits China. What does that mean? That means trade deals are less beneficial for the population of this country. That means restricting their ability to develop into more second and third tier kinds of economies because that threatens Chinese interests and rather reduce them to provide basic supplies or basic produce to China. All those kind of things first of all, harms these countries in the first place, but secondly, it creates a constant sense of insecurity. These countries can't determine their own fate. And maybe 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, this influence is such that people don't vote for a kind of government they necessarily want to have to represent them, or that China supports a kind of campaign of pro-China regimes that are probably also less democratic, less fair. Either way, these people have a right to self-determine, they have a right to decide their own fate, they have a right to develop economically, and that right is undermined by Chinese hegemony. All these things are real harms. Trade is probably going to happen outside the house. Maybe more, maybe less. But the most important thing is the US commitment to these states that need them to be able to survive as states. We're very happy to oppose.